Let's look at another way of representing frequency charts and graphs. Specifically, I want to introduce you to the idea of a frequency curve, and to do so, we're going to look at a frequency polygon first of all. Now think back to the histogram that we were looking at with the test scores. It had the different bars that went up and down, and then it went once they went up, they started going down. A frequency polygon is the same thing, except with bars, you put a dot at the top of each bar at the midpoint, and you take away the bars, and then you connect them like a dot to dot. And that kind of gives you a multi-sided figure, a polygon showing the frequency for each class interval, each bin, but it's only represented by a dot. Now, a frequency polygon by itself is not used very often. However, if we were to take this and smooth this out and just write an approximate diagram of it, we would call that a frequency curve. And frequency curves are used all the time to illustrate what type of frequency distribution we have. So here's a number of different shapes of frequency curves. The most common is the bell curve. The bell curve is also known as a normal curve. It basically shows what the normal score is and how there's a few people that are above it and a very few that are way above it. There's a few people below the normal score and very few way below, and it's the normal way of describing human behavior. However, if we had some events that were completely random, like if we were to roll a die, we would get 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, all at about the same rate. That would give us a uniform frequency distribution. No score is more common than the other. So this straight line is called a rectangular or a uniform frequency curve. Now sometimes we get just extreme scores, and we don't get very many middle scores. If we were to ask people what they think of someone very controversial, they might say, oh, I absolutely love him, or I absolutely hate him, and you wouldn't get very many scores in the middle. This would be called a U-shape. That's the opposite of a bell curve. These are fairly rare in psychology. Usually there's a normal score for people, and then there's fewer people on the extremes. But occasionally you get things that people only have an extreme score opinion about. A J-shaped curve is where there's not very many low scores, but almost everybody has a high score. We could have an inverted J where everybody has a high, most everybody has a low score, and very few people have a low score. But going back to bell curves, there's two important varieties of a bell curve. Here's a positive skew is a curve that if we drew a bell curve and in a normal way, but we had extra stuff on the positive tail, we would call that a positive skew. And a negatively skewed bell curve is when if we had a bell curve like this, we'd have extra stuff over on the negative side, we'd say that's negatively skewed. And a lot of times when we're dealing with humans, we get a bell curve. Sometimes it's symmetrical, like this one, but many times it's either positively or negatively skewed. Now let's talk more about the importance of the bell curve. Why is a bell curve so common in psychology and organizational psychology and anything having to do with humans? Well, first of all, human behavior, thoughts, etc. is varied. The scores are going to be spread out. No two humans are the same in every way. But nevertheless, there tends to be a normal or most common value for whatever we measure as humans. So if we're measuring people's height, maybe if we're measuring females, the most common height would be 5'3" or 5'4". That would be the high point on the curve. There's a few girls that are shorter and a few that are taller, and very few that are much, much shorter, and a few that are much, much taller. But the normal height's about 5'3" or 5'4" for females. So we can say that some values are above average and some values are below average, but most values are close to the average, and that's the normal score. Now, sometimes we can get skew because there might be what's known as a ceiling effect. A ceiling effect means you can't go any higher than that. If we were to talk to a bunch of Justin Bieber fans and give them on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do they like Justin Bieber, most of them would be 4s and 5s, even if they're absolutely crazy about him, because we're not letting them go more than 5, and we might have very few in the 0 and 1 since they are his fans. So that would be a negative skew due to a ceiling effect. A floor effect is when you can't go any lower. So if we were to talk to a bunch of people that hated the Kardashians, we would get lots of zeros on a 0 to 5 scale, maybe a few 1s, but we wouldn't get very many 4 or 5, and we would have a positively skewed bell curve that would be limited by the floor effect, where people couldn't go any lower than 0.